my mess. Okay. Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah, she's like a management analyst in the county administrator.
That's right. Yeah. Good afternoon. I would like to call to order this meeting of the Encinitas City Council, special meeting of the Encinitas City Council for Wednesday, March 22nd at 4 p.m. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Yes, Councilmember Blackwell,
Here.
Councilmember Ehlers,
Present.
Councilmember Hinsey,
Here?
Deputy Mayor Lyons,
Here.
and Mayor Krantz.
Here.
Record will show that all members of the city council are present.
Okay, thank you. And the one agenda item we have tonight is this is a study session, City Council study session, to discuss the no net loss requirements as identified in Government Code Section 65863 for the sixth cycle housing element, which runs from 2021 to 2029, and the likelihood that there will need to be additional site selection to get our housing element compliant with the law. So with that, we have Planning Manager Anders and Senior Planner Dacey.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members, and members of the public. My name is Patty Anders. I'm the Planning Manager of the Advanced Planning Division, and I'll be discussing the status of the housing element, Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, and the no net loss potential. I will then turn the presentation over to the city's special legal counsel, Barbara Kautz, to discuss the legal requirements of housing law regarding the no net loss. The study session will have two phases. The first phase will be no net loss, and if the council desires and there's time, we'll go into the second phase, which will be the discussion of the site selection. So I'll begin with no net loss. I'd like to start by reviewing the city's RHNA requirement, which is 1,554 units, of which 838 are required to be very low and low-income units. Let's see. This table is from the staff report, and it summarizes the status of all of the sixth cycle housing element sites. The 6 green rows are sites that have received entitlements, and the 5 yellow rows are sites currently in the process pursuing entitlements, and the bottom 3 rows are sites which have not yet submitted applications. This table shows a remaining capacity of 426 affordable units available for the housing element sites. As shown in this slide, it appears that the city could potentially hit a no net loss scenario during the current housing element planning period of 55 units if the 3 remaining sites develop at 100% affordable projects, and a deficit of 148 units if these 3 sites develop with only a 20% low-income unit project. If a deficit does occur, the city must identify sites not listed in the housing element that are available to provide lower income housing. Barbara will discuss the options for identifying more sites in her presentation, and they also are presented in the staff report. Staff would like to note that in addition to tracking the affordable units provided for the housing element sites, we also track all non-housing element projects with affordable units, and that includes density bonus projects, SB 9 projects, and inclusionary units. Those numbers are to date are highlighted in red, as you see in the table. So I just want to point out that staff does track both the housing element sites and non-housing element sites, but we are seeing that the housing element sites provide the highest number of units provided for development. Okay, the next steps. We will be conducting public workshops over the next few months on site selection, and we will begin the environmental impact report this year, and it will be completed by early next year, and we will complete the no net loss analysis as required by state law. The no net loss analysis with sites selected for rezone would come to the City Council in approximately April-May of 2024, with a deadline to the County Registrar of August 2024 and a Prop A vote on the November ballot. So now I'll turn it over to Barbara to discuss the legal requirements of no net loss. Oops. Did it?
Sorry, I was just looking at the slide. It doesn't seem to have my whole slide, but it's all right. Hi, I'm Barbara Couts. I'm Special Legal Counsel. I'm very pleased to be back here. We've worked with the city, the mayor reminded me, since 2014 on various housing elements and other projects. So anyway, happy to be back and help the city. So the requirements are state laws that every housing element has to have, when it's originally adopted, enough sites to meet the city's regional housing needs allocation. And so Encinitas was required to have sites available for 838 lower-income units. The housing element, in fact, had capacity for almost 1,700 lower-income units. We're a very large buffer, actually larger than the buffer, what we might call the buffer of any other city that I've worked with. Next slide. So under the no net loss provisions in the government code, the city must assure that at all times it has enough sites available for 838 lower income units. And if a project either has fewer lower income units than were projected, or fewer total units than are shown in the housing element, the city has to find that there's still enough sites in the housing element to meet the remaining lower income need. And in Encinitas, projects have typically been proposed on the lower income sites that have more total units than were projected, but typically fewer lower income units. The city has not been lucky enough to have a project that's on the lower income sites that's 100% affordable yet. So next slide. This is an example of what's happened to the city's lower income housing sites. So the housing element might typically show that a site's suitable, this is just an example, for 200 lower income units. A developer has a 35% density bonus, so the project has 270 units, but only 20% of the base density, the 200 units, needed to be affordable. So with only 40 lower income units, that's 160 fewer than were shown in the housing element. And when the city approves the project, and it's been doing this consistently, it has to demonstrate that the sites in the housing element still have enough capacity to meet the remaining lower income need. So next slide. So the findings that are required by the no net loss statute happen when the city, quote, allows development with fewer lower income units than shown in the housing element. And the statute says that this occurs when the city takes either quasi-judicial, is the language used, or legislative action. A legislative action might be a rezoning or a general plan amendment, but the city most commonly approves projects in what's called quasi-judicial, which means the normal entitlement process, something like design review or a coastal development permit or a use permit. So at the time that the city, quote, allows the development with fewer lower income units than shown in the housing element, it has to make specific findings, which I'll get to. The language is that the city has allowed the development, but in fact the state law says that the city cannot turn down a project because it doesn't have enough lower income units. So really the city's required to approve the projects despite their having fewer lower income units than shown in the housing element. Next slide. So the findings that the city needs to make are that, one, that the project's consistent with the general plan, but secondly, that the remaining sites in the housing element are adequate to accommodate the remaining unmet need for lower income housing. And if the sites in the housing element aren't adequate, the city has several options to show that it still can accommodate all the need it has for lower income housing. So the city can identify affordable housing built or approved or possibly planned on other sites. In the slide that Ms. Anders showed, there had been 16 affordable housing units approved on sites that were not shown in the housing element. And any more affordable housing that's approved on sites not in the housing element can help make up the differential. Or the city could identify other suitable sites, say that are already zoned at 30 units an acre, or with plans for affordable housing. But if the city simply does not have enough of these options to make up the deficit, then according to the state law, the city has to identify other sites and rezone them at 30 units an acre within 180 days of the date that it finds that it's run out of sites in the housing element and doesn't have other suitable sites. I might just add here that the city's deficit is really small. It looks like it's ranging from, 55 to 150, about 150 units, something like that. That's a pretty small deficit, and if the city could have a little bit outside my wheelhouse here, but one affordable housing project might make up the difference if that could happen. Anyway, next slide. If there are sites that need to be rezoned, then the state law says they have to be adequate. The city's own housing element says that they'll conform with state law. And the key provisions there are that the sites have to allow 30 units an acre. There has to be adequate water, sewer, and utilities, which has not been an issue in Encinitas. If they're not vacant, then there has to be some evidence that they'll develop within the planning period. The distribution of the sites has to, quote, affirmatively further fair housing. They can't all be concentrated in one area, or particularly not in low opportunity areas. In fact, the entire city of Encinitas is a high opportunity area, so that's not usually an issue, but the distribution is not supposed to concentrate the units. And lastly, in Encinitas, a Prop A vote would be needed to upzone the sites. So with that, I'd be happy to answer questions and
Okay, and yes, I remember Kristen Gaspar and I were on the subcommittee that hired Goldfarb and Lippman, and that was when we voted to round down on density bonus projects, which caused a couple of lawsuits and started this whole process in litigation, and it took us a while to get in compliance with state law, but we're there, and it would be great to stay there. So with that, Councilmember Ehlers.
A question of clarification. As far as the timing of that allowance or that quasi-judicial, can you speak to what date you choose? Like, obviously, if it's a planning commission approval that does not get appealed, it's the planning commission date. But if it's a planning commission denial that then goes on a month later and gets a city council approval, is it the city council date, or is it the original denial date that would be the trigger that we would have to make a no net loss finding?
I mean, it would be the final action. My understanding, and the community development director can correct me, is that there's usually no net loss findings prepared for both bodies.
Okay, but whichever one was the final one. So yeah, I think you hit my next question, which is if it's an approval by the planning commission that then gets appealed by opponents to the city council, and is the final action then the city council, and that would be the date that would start the 180-day clock?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Councilmember Hensy.
Thanks, Barbara. It's nice to see you, and thanks for the clear presentation and keeping us on track with our housing element. And it's of the utmost importance that we maintain it and that we're doing a good job at being in front of it and planning for it. I just had a few questions, and one is, Within the 180-day timeframe, what is the date that we say, yes, we've upzoned? Is it the date of the vote and a passing vote, or is that the date that the council sends a ballot measure to the registrar of voters? What date are we trying to go for?
You're trying to go for the date of the vote because under Proposition A, your ordinance isn't effective until the vote is held.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we probably need to, okay, I'll let that stand right there. Something that we learned from having gone through this process in the past was that we went ahead and upzoned a bunch of sites around the city, and then we wanted to ask for certain things. And one of the asks that the Planning Commission explored exhaustively was looking to see if we could up the inclusionary number of affordable units within any one of these sites. And the answer that we got there was that, yeah, maybe at some of these sites you could, but in other ones you couldn't. And then what ended up happening was that most developers went with the 20% by right zoning. So in this cycle, is there a different order that we could go through? And this is just a scenario, is that we say, we're considering all these different sites based on this criteria. Developers start coming to us, and then at that point, we start the study to be able to decide if there are different levels of affordability so that we could see higher levels at certain sites. Then we've got the findings to enter into a development agreement and say, here's what the city would like to do in order to upzone your site. And another thing that would be attractive is saying, what's a community benefit that you could provide at your site? So a multi-purpose room, that's nice, but a daycare might be nicer. Or a dog run is cool, but a community park or some enhancements to the surrounding area would be even better for us. So do you envision a pathway for us that we could get a little bit more?
Yes, I mean, you could do the study of the maximum inclusion area at the time you do the rezoning. The state, there have been court cases that have upheld what's called conditional zoning, where you can put conditions on the zoning. So you zone at 30 units an acre, and one of the conditions is that any development at that, at that density has, let's say, 25% affordable.
That would be really great. One final question on this round, and it's that something that seems to be effective in the city of San Diego is that they can allow their residents to build 2 ADUs per lot if one of those ADUs is an affordable unit. And we are not able to do that here in the city of Encinitas unless we went through an SB9 process. So it seems like 250 ADUs that are assigned as part of our affordable housing, that's really good. But it would be great if we could get even more ADUs as part of that share. So when we do go to the ballot, we would have to put something like this on the ballot if we wanted to allow for an additional affordable ADU. Do you see that as something that we'd be able to do that would make a meaningful difference in our no net loss?
HCD has come up with an interpretation of ADU law saying that everyone is entitled to 2 ADUs in their property. One interior ADU, carved out of an existing building, plus a detached ADU. So in effect, according to HCD, that's already in effect. So you can't give the incentive of, getting another, of getting a second ADU to, that would need to be affordable. They've been writing cities sort of randomly, telling them that their ADU ordinances are not in compliance with state law, stating this. They have a guidebook that they published in July of 2022 without telling anybody that came to this new interpretation.
Interesting. So I know that here in the city of Encinitas, we do have a pretty progressive ADU policy, and that we do allow for that JADU within the building itself, and then another separate one that's a freestanding ADU. And my goal would be to get us to have the JADU plus an additional ADU on the property. So,
I mean, you can certainly propose an ordinance that allows people more than they're entitled to by state law if if the additional development is affordable. Yes, you could do that.
So I guess what we would need to know from the state, if that was going to be worth our time to author a measure that would need to be voted on for Prop A, is would the state allow us to increase the number of ADUs they assign us as affordable, which is currently 250? Could we go to 350? Would it be meaningful for us to be able to increase in that way?
Yeah, and that I don't know the answer to.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Councilmember Lyons, First
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Just a few questions for clarification for me. As far as the zoning, I was under the understanding that it was upzoning to 16 units per acre. That sounds like it was my misunderstanding. You said 30 units per acre.
Yeah, so they would need, because they're replacing sites that are zoned at 30, that were required to be zoned at 30 units per acre, they would need to be zoned at 30 units an acre. That's what the default, quote, the default density for lower-income housing. It is possible to try to convince HCD that a lower density, would create affordable housing, but they usually, they would require for that the city have a history of developing affordable housing at a lower density, and there isn't such a history. The city, in fact, tried to convince HCD with the sixth cycle that 25 units an acre would be adequate, and was unsuccessful really for that reason, because there wasn't any affordable housing in Encinitas.
Okay, thank you. I like the train of thinking, the line of thinking that Councilmember Hinsey, I think, was getting at, in that we have some ideas that we'd like to give some thought to, so that we don't have to go to rezoning. So that is, what about 100% affordable, and whether it's city subsidized or private development. We don't have that. I'm assuming if we move forward with that, that wouldn't require rezoning, but it's a commitment towards affordable housing that would meet our RENA obligation, would meet the no net loss. And so given that as an example, and I have some others, but I think that one's the easiest one to think about. What would we have to do in what time frame to be able to say that's our approach, and that's how we want to address the no net loss that we're experiencing? Is there a time frame that we would, and at what level would we have to commit within a time frame to go that direction for it to be accounted for?
Well, if you've run out of sites, of course, you have 180 days after the last action, I guess, to do something. So let's say that the city approved a project, even if it were not built, or maybe substantially proposed a project on it's a little bit, it's a little bit loosey-goosey. But let's say that the city had a publicly owned site and put out RFPs for affordable housing, and had a realistic financing plan. Maybe that would be enough.
Sounds like it's territory that hasn't been really clarified,
Yes, yeah.
but has
Yeah.
some reasonable
Right.
boundaries on what you might expect.
HCD has a rather lengthy memo about no net loss, where they talk about any affordable units that have been already approved or built. So that we know that's a boundary, but is there another boundary? I'm not sure. They're looking at project approval as a boundary, but
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, that's it for now.
Yeah, so one of the more frustrating parts of this is that, for me, the number of units that we have coming down the pipe is going to have an effect on the market. And so it's frustrating that we have to establish before these units even get on the market what they're going to be renting for, because the law of supply and demand is pretty well established, and it isn't clear exactly what the rents for these units are going to be in 2 years or more. And that's the other part of this that's super frustrating, is that, once these projects are entitled, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be in construction right away, especially given economic factors that we're seeing right now. There are some projects that may not get built. So this notion that we're going to have to continue to upzone when there are so many unknowns and HCD is trying to pin us down on this is as I say, quite frustrating. The other thing that is frustrating is that the memo that HCD put out does talk frequently about, if it says here, who makes the findings? The body that takes action or approves a jurisdiction action to reduce a parcel's density or approve a development at a lower density would make the findings. None of these projects are at a lower density than we have in our housing element. In fact, some of them are significantly higher density. And so the notion that in some way or another, the city has an obligation now to upzone more because of the actions that, the developer took and got significantly more density it just seems crazy to me. So, and the other question that I have is that in terms of, our housing element had the 1,700 units. We now have about 2,100 units that are in the pipeline. Is there a way to create a voucher program that would supplement the difference between affordable and market so that you could essentially forestall the need to upzone based upon the ability to have a voucher program that would make up that difference?
Let's see, HCD won't allow, for instance, there's Section 8 vouchers that the city has, but they won't give you credit for those. But the city can get credit for any new units built that are actually rented at an affordable rent.
Right.
So
So the
if the
question is,
city-
if the market rate is higher than affordable, if the city were to make up the difference somehow with a voucher of our own, would that, a program such as that be possible under the rules that HCD promulgates in order to address some of these issues related to no net loss?
I think that if the city, I'm guessing with some of these because, I'm just giving you my best advice because there's nothing in writing and we don't really know. But I think that if the city had an agreement with a property owner and the units were actually rented, the new units were actually rented at an affordable price, they should count. In the annual progress reports that the city is required to fill out, there is room to report new units that are not deed restricted, but are rented at affordable rents.
Okay, thank you. We do have some public speakers, so before I go on to second round, maybe we should hear from the speakers.
Can we just finish up clarification questions?
Sure.
Okay. Me? Can we go to page 4 and the table on there? I want to make sure I understand the numbers and everybody understands. Actually, page 4 of the staff report had the chart of 338 RENA obligation and then the 250 ADU capacity. And my understanding is the ADU capacity is how many how many lower income ADUs would be produced during the 8-year period? Yeah, so I see a nod, yes. I'm just waiting for the, Don't you miss the days when you could just throw the hard copy up in front of everybody? That's right. But I could also get on there with a Sharpie and write, so it was kind of. So my question is the 250 that's something we generate based on the estimates of a survey or whatever. Previously, I think we would get, in the fifth cycle, I think we got 23% credit based on our sample survey of the total number of ADUs, and then we plug that into the fifth, and that this is probably a projection of the number of ADUs, slightly increased, the bulk, that times the same 23%. In last meeting, we talked about the ADUs we'd been producing, and a recent survey came in at 10%. So do we have, since this is our number, the 250, do we have to true this up during the sixth cycle for what actually happens, or do we always have that credit for 250 until we do a seventh cycle?
So the 250 is the portion of the 1,000 for the entire 8-year planning cycle. And we do have to monitor to see about every 2 years to see how many ADUs we are producing.
Okay. So this is not some agreed-to number with HCD. This is actually something we have to demonstrate through a sampling method of somehow. It sounds like the 1,000 times, and I think the number's 23%, but maybe it's 25. And the question is, does it go down or up from that, or do we produce more or less of the bulk of the 1,000 ADUs during the cycle, and that'll determine whether we're in compliance, so.
So let me try to answer your question. So we are of the 1,000 ADUs for the planning period, we are, HCD allowed us to count 250 towards meeting our RENA. We could do more than that, but you're limited on the percentage, right? We can't say we're going to hit all of our affordable from ADUs, but we can produce more than the 250.
And
to
get
qualify.
credit, and get
Yes,
credit
to
for it?
qualify towards our
Okay,
RENA.
good. And then there was some talk of ADU and JADU and Encinitas, and I just wanted staff to comment. Don't we by right allow both an ADU and a JADU in our ordinance that we adopted under to be in compliance with the state law, correct?
Yes, we have to comply with state law that allows both of those types of ADUs.
Okay, and there's no conditional today on the JADU as far as making it affordable. It is market rate or whatever the owner wants to charge.
Yes.
Okay. And let's see, and then this goes back a ways, Barbara. But it came up multiple times. At one of the planning commissions where I probably chair or maybe not, you responded to these, I call them step-up zones, but affordable housing overlay zones, RR30, where you take a base zone, RR2, RR5, whatever it might be, you step up, and I think the comment you made in the quote that I've repeated often is that it's, quote, fairly common to have a higher inclusionary rate on those step-up zones, not above the 20% or 15% we're currently at. Can you confirm that again one more time?
Yes, I think that's an accurate statement. What HCD says in their in their guidebook is you have to demonstrate, though, that it's economically feasible, as Councilmember Hinsey was alluding to. So either if you have a very high number, some cities have had overlay zones that require, say, 50% affordable, but you have to show, if you're going to have a higher number, you have to show that the city has subsidies or some other kind of, or that it's, either that it's economically feasible for a market rate project to do it, or that the city is providing subsidies that will make it, make that higher number work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, thanks. POGA speakers, please.
Yes, we do have 5 at the moment. First speaker is Susan Turney, and she does have a time donation from Dean Turney, followed by Glenn O'Grady, and then Bob Kent.
Susan Turney, Encinitas. Let's take a look at how we got here, meaning the no net loss requirement to upzone thousands more units to cover deficits created by the 15 Measure U/6 housing cycle sites. We didn't get here because of NIMBY residents who say no to everything, and not because of Prop A constraints. Excuse me, if you could just hold off, I'm putting my slide up. Okay. We're here before, but could you just hold? never mind. We're here because the council made two different commitments, one to the state promising 100% affordability for lower-income housing on all 15 sites, and one promise to developers that required just 15 to 20%. The difference between the two plans is 85%, a 4,700 unit gap that under no net loss rules must be made up elsewhere in the city. Note that this 100% plan was submitted after the law changed to require that the units must be built and not just planned for. This makes the false claim even more serious. The buffer does not begin to cover the gap. In fact, no net loss was triggered because the buffer was wholly insufficient and ran out after the first 6 projects were approved. To cover up the 85% gap, city staff accounts for project shortfalls only after a project is approved. Not sure if you guys realize that's what you're doing. This perpetuates the myth that our upzoning will deliver on its state-mandated commitment of 100% affordable housing, and it shields the public from the truth. Had a realistic plan been submitted to the state in the first place, we would not have triggered no net loss and we wouldn't be here today. Showing two such different sets of numbers was so deceptive that it prompted another California mayor to wonder of the Encinitas Council, quote, "Why on earth would they be so dishonest with the state and their own residents? We would never consider such a thing," end quote. That the state accepts these plans initially and looks the other way does not make it right to tell the 100% lie. Taking Fox Point Farms AgriHood as an example, and by the way, I think it landed at R17, nowhere near R30. It promised 100% affordable, but fell 209 units short with the council's approval, prompting a letter of warning from HCD to make up the units elsewhere. With the 85% gap on Fox Point Farms, it translates to 1,400 units that must go on newly identified sites. That's just Fox Point Farms. All 15 sites carry this 85% shortfall. Letters submitted today to the city all urge 100% housing on city-owned sites, and it's ironic that Mayor Kranz was in the majority vote to remove L7 from one of the as a Measure U site. According to then Mayor Blakespear, L7 was the city's, quote, "only chance at 100% affordable housing," end quote. It was removed in favor of 15% low-income, 85% market rate housing, rather than the 100% it could have provided. Let's go back to the 4,700 units we need to replace from Measure U. Could you pop my slide up, Roy? Thanks. At 20% affordable, the 4,700 units equal 20 more Goodson projects. What neighborhoods can accommodate them? Where will they go? El Camino Real? Specific plan? These small affordability percentages keep us on a perpetual treadmill of upzoning. While it's great for developers, it's disastrous for residents, the city, our infrastructure, and traffic. Even with the council's largely symbolic increase from 15% to 20% low income, that amount still drops back down below 15% when you count density bonus in. Instead, how about let's get us off the treadmill by increasing the affordable percentage. Stop repeating the developer mantra that it won't pencil out. Watch Planning Commissioner Kevin Doyle's analysis. It was supported unanimously by the Planning Commission. It proved that 50% is still profitable for developers. Even the city's housing consultants, KMA, were unable to find fault with his work. Council members, learn for yourselves how the numbers and percentages relate to one another. Don't defer to staff and don't repeat the failed and deceitful plans of the previous councils. Today's staff report actually doubles down on the 100% claim on the sites not yet approved. The small deficit that Ms. Couch referred to assumes this 100% affordable on the remaining sites. You know you're not going to get that. I urge you not to submit another false 100% plan to voters. It's going to end any hope you have of passing a Prop A vote.
Glenn O'Grady, followed by Bob Kent, Teresa Beauchamp, and then Bob Ayers.
Hi, Glenn O'Grady, Leucadia. Just real quickly on Kelly's point, it's my understanding you can have both an ADU and a JDU on one site already. So that's good. And as was just mentioned, and to Barbara's point, we still have that Quail Garden site that the city owns that we could, I mean, it still has to go to a vote because it's not properly zoned, but we could have a housing, affordability group come in and build, not at the density of 30, but whatever would pencil out, I mean, they can do, and they don't have to build the whole site. I mean, I don't know how many units it would get. Somebody who worked in Poway and saw what the city had developed for affordable housing, I mean, it was good stuff, and you wouldn't even know, if people didn't tell you that's affordable housing, you wouldn't know it. It blended right in. It was great. And finally, we sort of spend this whack-a-mole each year of this ham-handed legislation that gets passed up in Sacramento. And we individually, cities and counties, bitch about it, but has anybody tried to get us all together, maybe have some kind of committee, workshop, whatever, to come up with a plan to, I mean, hopefully the state would be involved, but even if they weren't, to present them with a reasonable plan of how to implement and create more affordable housing instead of this crap that they come up with. I mean, they're really sort of out of touch, which is funny because a lot of them were council members originally. But it's just a ham-handed solution. And, I know like the Attorney General's suing now Huntington Beach because they're pushing back. But we get picked off one by one as opposed to coming in with a unified, maybe through League of Cities or Cal APA or all of them. Let's get proactive and push against them proactively and not onesie twosies where they can ignore us kind of thing. So I'd just like to see more proactive action. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, City Council members. My name is Bob Kent. First, thank you, Encinitas resident, member of Keys for Homes. First, thank you for scheduling this study session to discuss the no net loss requirements. And again, thank you for making housing affordability a city priority at your recent strategic planning session. These two issues are interconnected. Firstly, so the city can meet its RHNA requirements and maintain a compliant housing element plan, and most importantly, so the city can continue to move the needle forward to solve our housing affordability challenges by identifying and building more affordable homes for our seniors on a fixed income, as well as for our family residents and workers who are commuting long distances or finding difficult living situations in order to stay here in Encinitas, the city they serve. We know that building more affordable homes is challenging, it's complicated, it takes time. So in alignment with housing affordability being a top priority, and in conjunction with the no net loss rule requirement to identify additional capacity to build more affordable homes, please dedicate city resources to build a 100% or as close as possible affordable community. A well-designed, sustainable community, both financially and environmentally, that fits well in our neighborhoods, and we know it can be done because it's been done in other places. Also, a 100% affordable community will result in actually building fewer units while helping achieve our RHNA requirements, thereby reducing our impacts to infrastructure and traffic. The private sector cannot solve our housing affordability challenges on its own. So I hope the city will take a leadership role here by committing city resources to leverage additional funding sources which will increase housing affordability in alignment with our strategic priority. Let's do our part for current and future generations to come, and thank you for your service.
Next speaker is Tricia Beauchamp, followed by Bob Ayers, and then Bob Prendergast.
Hi, Honorable Mayor Kranz, Deputy Mayor Lyons, and Council Members Hinsey, Ehlers, and Blackwell. I appreciate you providing Encinitas residents with today's no net loss workshop. Special thanks to Planning Manager Patty Anders, Senior Planner Melinda Dacey for preparing this great staff report, and Attorney Barbara Kautz for interpreting the law for us. Really appreciate you all. The city of Encinitas will approach the no net loss marker in 2023 due to a shortfall in low and very low income housing actualized on the housing element sites. It's important to prioritize the pursuit of a 100% affordable housing community on city-owned land. A 100% affordable community will result in fewer overall units being built and provide the opportunity to significantly narrow the gap to meet our current shortfall of the low and very low income unit RHNA requirements. At this time, we all need to be educated by a developer who specializes in building the 100% affordable communities on how to navigate through the complex financing required. Please review the slide I emailed to you yesterday. It clearly illustrates that the financing puzzle requires all hands on deck to include city, county, state governments, and financial institutions. Let's get educated on a path forward for 100% affordable housing opportunity in order to house our seniors who built our city, our children who were raised here, our workforce, and our creatives. Thank you all for your service.
Bob Ayers, Encinitas resident. Meetings like this help educate us. We all need to be educated. Thank you for doing this. We heard even today somewhere between 55, 100, up to 4,700 units. We need to be educated so that we can make good decisions and know who's speaking out of well-informed basis. Thanks for having these meetings and going on with them, with more of them. There are experts among us. You have experts on your staff. Our mayor brings the expertise and institutional knowledge that will prevent us from making more mistakes and keep us on the right path. Bob Kent is here, the Honorable Barbara Couch. You can rely on your experts to help us make these good decisions. Please do. We need more affordable housing to provide a place for children, our children, elder parents, and our productive citizens to work. Renters, owners, the low and middle income, the homeless, we all need housing. This is not just a math equation. These are real people looking for solid places to live in a predictable fashion. Try to find consensus among each other. This is a highly politically charged issue, and let's not use it to score political points. Let's work together so that our electorate can know that you guys are working in one direction. We need to work towards solutions. They're not even close to perfect. A 100% affordable project is going to be tough, messy, and risky. Mr. Kranz, Mayor Kranz used the word super frustrating. Yes, it's going to be that. Let's think about our citizens. Thank you for all your work.
Good afternoon. Bob Prendergast, resident. Lots of Bobs today. Three real questions for clarification. Mayor Kranz asked the question regarding vouchers, and let's just take the hypothetical back to Barbara. If the market rate unit is $100 and the low income, whether it's very low or moderate, is $80, and the city makes up the difference with $20, does that have to be a deed restricted unit, or can we get the credit for the voucher as part of our RHNA obligation? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, that's one question. Next question is, under the housing density laws, or the housing density laws, that if we deny a project at Planning Commission or at City Council, the onus is on the city to have a burden of proof to why we deny it, or is that burden of proof financial? And if so, do we have to argue the feasibility financially of, let's just say for discussion purposes, 20% affordable versus 40% affordable? So now I want to decline it because I want a 40% affordability for the inclusionary rule, and now the developer comes back and says it's not financially feasible. What is the crux of the argument or the discussion? A return on cost calculation, a profitability calculation? If the onus of proof, the burden of proof is on the city, what is that burden? And how do we get to the burden? And then Last question is just some clarification over, per your comments, Barbara, can we mandate, if we're going to go from R1, like the church site, to R30, can we mandate a percentage with the up zone or the step zone? Can we mandate that to be 40% versus the state required 20% density bonus? Those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
Mayor, that does conclude public speakers.
Okay, thank you. And Speaker brought up the Measure T and Measure U, and I'm reflecting on our work on the task force and the approach that we took in terms of calculating density, and the sites that were selected was one that we knew going in was going to likely require upzoning in the future, and it was not intended to be deceptive to anyone, and I don't think it was. And I would point out that had we taken the other approach and used only the inclusionary to calculate our affordable, our upzoning parcels would have instead been 15. They would have been about 45 or so, and I will point out that neither measure passed the voters, and a measure that had 3 times as many parcels would have been a lot less likely to have been successful in a vote. So it's ironic to hear the argument that we should have been upzoning more parcels in order to avoid this current situation. But I think it was known on the task force and on the council that we would be in this situation and we would have to go to the voters again. And with Prop A being what it is, I think that that is the correct approach, because success at the ballot box on a housing element is better for our community than to have a judge order us to adopt a housing element and put all the power into the hands of HCD. So it is a challenge that 5 of us here have accepted. We plan to work with the community to come up with some solutions, and I want to try and be as creative as possible, because the impacts of continued development at this density is not going to be good for our city. So my goal is to find affordability from what we've approved and the sites that the city owns. So we have a lot of work ahead. With that, Deputy Mayor Lyons.
Did we get a response from Barbara on the questions that would you like to, because that would be helpful to me, and then I have a few.
So the first question is about getting credit, if the city provides vouchers to reduce rents to affordable levels. As I've repeated, the state does allow non-deed restricted units rented at affordable rents to be counted as affordable units, so that if the rent is affordable, and whether that's accomplished by a voucher or some other mechanism, it should be able to be counted on the city's annual progress reports. The second question was about the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the city if it denies a housing project under the Housing Accountability Act. And the city's, let's see, the Housing Accountability Act essentially requires that a project be approved if it conforms with all objective standards, unless there's a serious health or safety problem, which it's a very difficult finding to make in terms of the health or safety problem. So essentially, if a project conforms with all objective standards, it has to be approved. So if the city currently has inclusion area of 15 to 20%, if the project conforms with that and all the other standards, then it really needs to be approved. The city can't enforce a higher, affordability requirement just on a one-off basis and use that as a way to deny a project. But in terms of whether a city can require higher affordability than 15 or 20%, yes, if it's financially feasible. Some of you may recall that the Planning Commission initially recommended to the City Council a higher level of affordability than is currently in the city's inclusionary ordinance. The city's consultant, KMA, did not agree that that was feasible, that number was feasible. And as a consequence, HCD, again, wrote the city, I believe, a letter saying that you really cannot approve this unless it's economically feasible, or it'll be interpreted as a way to kill projects. So the issue is really to, if property's upzoned, then typically it may be able to handle a higher level of affordability, than not. But there does need to be some evidence of economic feasibility for the city's affordability requirements. The lead case on inclusionary requirements in California is a California Supreme Court case called the California CBIA, California Building Industry Association versus the City of San Jose. And in that case, the court said that inclusionary requirements are considered like rent or price control. That's how the court analyzed them, and that they could not be confiscatory, meaning that the developer needed to be entitled to a reasonable rate of return. So that's why we always do recommend that economic feasibility studies be done.
Thank you. I would like to touch on a few things that both I've heard from our public speakers here, but also that I've heard from others in the community. One is we have identified with this milestone we will be at with a no net loss that what we need to provide for is 55 units plus a buffer. Will that satisfy our housing element through the full 8 years of our what do you call it, term of our housing element? I'm just curious, is this, we do this and then this is good? Or is there some other thing out there?
Well, one issue is whether the 3 sites that have not yet proposed applications come in. So in that case, the 55 could be, I believe, 148, or somewhere in there. So that's one issue. And I think the other issue is what was alluded to, is making sure that the ADUs are as affordable as were projected. But yes, that should do it.
Okay, thank you. Also, I hear, and it's just innuendo, so I have no idea, but you've got experience across the whole state, so maybe you could shed a light on, do other jurisdictions require more than a 20% affordable metric on these housing element projects? Are there other jurisdictions, municipalities who maybe require up to 50%? Or do you have the background with other states to be able to shed some light on that?
You mean other cities?
I mean cities, yeah.
I mean, typically, inclusionary requirements are not higher than what Encinitas proposes. They are sometimes in limited situations. San Francisco upzoned a whole area, and then I think increased the affordability to 25%. But now they're proposing to reduce it because the developers are saying that development's not feasible with that. So San Francisco's taking a look at that. There were some earlier affordable housing overlay zones with 50 or 100% affordable that I'm aware of. But typically, I'm aware of one site where then 100% affordable project was built. I don't know the details about how that occurred, but typically where they have had those high percentages, housing hasn't really been built, no housing has been built, and as a consequence, HCD, in looking at the adequacy of sites, wants is demanding some evidence that the number is feasible.
Thank you. I just have one more question, and this is more for staff, maybe Roy, but let me know. Everything's all, I mean, the whole world moves based on what funding you have available. And I really want to look at what we can do to promote our 100% affordable housing solutions. We not only identified this as a priority for our city council, this strategic planning, that we really, in this planning cycle, in this year, we want to make significant progress on 100% affordable housing. But there are also other really tangible ways to move forward, such as the voucher idea, using a voucher to kind of cover that gap. These are ways we can move forward, generally could be achieved without having to go through rezoning, and yet meet our affordable housing objectives as a city, blend with our character better, meet the community's desires, not have to go through rezoning. You know, I'm just seeing it check a lot of boxes to go that direction, instead of jumping through all the hoops of doing things like bringing this to the voters, going through a rezoning. You know, there's resources associated with going in all those directions, but if we say, okay, no, we're not doing that, we're just gonna look at how we can make affordable housing happen here. So it comes back to, it's all about funding. Do we have some restrictions on how we can raise our funds internally at the city to invest in affordable housing? I know that's a pretty tricky question. I haven't asked you, but you know, are there some ways that through fees or through other mechanisms we can invest in our own affordable housing budget in our fund to then help subsidize creating more affordable housing?
That is truly a tricky question, but I'll try to answer it. So right now, as part of our inclusionary ordinance, we have a funding or revenue source through the in lieu fee. So that's one avenue in which we can get funding towards subsidizing affordable housing. If the council desire to develop a fee, a housing fee, then similar to the inclusionary, we would have to do go through a fee study and do an economic analysis on the need for the fee and what the fee would be used for. So that's one avenue to generate revenue towards our affordable housing fund to subsidize affordable housing. We can explore other options in terms of revenue source, one of which it could be grant funding that are available through the state and through the federal government. So that's one option, but we can definitely explore other options to get as many funds available to support the city's efforts.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hensy.
Thank you. Let me just make one clarification because Glenn asked. So right now, one home could be entitled to 2 ADUs. One would be within the existing home and the second one is separate. So what we would need to do is pass a Prop A vote to actually have 2 separate ADUs on a lot. And the only way you could achieve that now is by splitting your lot through SB 9. So it would help us to generate more to be able to do that. So, and then one question. So the housing headlines these days, when you read about other cities who are not in as advantageous position as we are in having a certified and compliant housing element, are facing builder's remedy projects in which a builder can come in and not adhere to any design guidelines and build any project that they'd like to, provided it doesn't violate health and human safety. And my understanding is that we could find ourselves in a similar position the minute that we have run through our buffer. So when I look at the timeline presented to us with a vote of Prop A in 2024, to me it sounds like there's 2 scenarios that play out. Either one, the day after a vote fails, we open ourselves up to a builder's remedy project. Is that consistent with the understanding that we should be operating with?
I think the city would not be subject to a builder's remedy project unless HCD pulled the certification, the approval of your housing element. I guess somebody could assume that you would no longer comply and make an application, but technically you would have a compliant housing element until HCD, pulled the approval.
Okay. And then the other scenario, which I think is scarier, is that we run through this buffer more quickly than we are anticipating with this timeline, and that we have a lapse between the time we've run out of the buffer and the next vote that we're in the hot seat to find these additional sites. So what I'm hearing is that either we do a special election, send something to the voters as soon as we possibly can, or we've got to find a way that we're building a 100% affordable project on land that we already have. And I think you provided a few other pathways. So that second scenario is a potential situation we could find ourselves in.
Yes, again, it has to do, though, with whether you have an adequate housing element or not. Your housing element is actually adequate. It talks about, I suppose, again, it has to do with somebody, let's say I'm kind of going backward. With the builder's remedy, first of all, somebody would have to demonstrate that your housing element is no longer adequate, in order to do that. Secondly, the project would still be subject to CEQA. So it's not I think the newspapers have been creating an assumption that someone comes in with a builder's remedy project, the city has to approve it the next day. That it's not quite that simple. So, it would, so, if you miss the deadline, that's really what you're talking about. You missed the 180-day deadline. Would that mean that your housing element is no longer adequate? Somebody would have to demonstrate that. Yes, it's a possibility. I don't mean to denigrate it, but it would be somewhat complicated.
Okay, thank you. I find that partially reassuring, and also further reason why we need to pursue a 100% affordable project. Thank you.
Councilmember Haylers.
I want to go, and this is for staff or for Barbara. When we're talking about subsidizing lower income housing, I think there was a number in the fifth cycle that was $271,000 per unit subsidy required to provide the low income. That was actually in the document. I think Barbara, in some of our housing element meetings, housing element task force meetings, and maybe it's your Bay Area background, you would say 400, 500,000. Now, this was how many years ago? Do we have an updated number on what we would expect the amount of money we would have to subsidize in order to convert a market rate unit to a lower income unit? And I'll start with staff.
Yeah, we don't have an updated number. That's something that we can look into as part of this effort. So,
but we would know it's certainly higher and probably much higher than the 271. And then, Barbara, in your experience with other municipalities anywhere around the state, have you been quoting any other numbers, or have we broken 500,000 yet? Is my only that I have a pit in my stomach worrying where this might go.
I could talk to my colleagues who are often involved with affordable housing and ask them what the total subsidy per unit is. I think TCAC, also the Tax Credit Allocation Commission, has I think one of their issues now is the amount of subsidy that's requested. I don't know if they have that data on their website or not, but it would be interesting to know. I do know that I've read articles saying that in San Francisco, the total cost of an affordable unit exceeds $1 million.
And luckily, we're not there. But
you're not there, but yeah.
So just doing a little math, if we had let's say we needed to make up the difference for 148 units, if that, just grabbing that number out of the air, and I'm assuming 400,000, which is probably an older number and probably low, we're talking $59 million. So just so everybody puts that in perspective. Now, that's over 8 years. So that's about $7 million a year.
Yeah,
and so when we're going into our budget discussions that we just had, and we talk about, and we're worried about where are we going to get $250,000 for this or $200,000 for that, we're not talking about $7 million for the city to provide. And you know, that probably, that's a pretty sizable number, you know, that, I just worry about that. So I want to explore the subsidy approach, but
Yeah, and I would point
have
out-
my doubts.
I
So-
would point out that what you're talking about is the cost to deed restrict the unit. And what I'm talking about is something that leaves it a market rate unit, but helps to provide the gap, pay for the gap, and, you know, isn't a, you know, multi-million all at once sort of.
You're talking about the annuity payment, and I'm talking about the present value of the annuity payment, I think, to put it in financial terms.
Well, and you're talking about something that would theoretically deed restrict that unit, right?
I'm talking about the subsidy of the monthly rent going out for 55 years or forever. Just as a general, I just want to make sure we talk. The expense for that, I'm not saying no to it, but
Well,
I want to make sure we're all talking. So, and
Well, it's a big number, yeah, there's no question about it, but, you know, when you take a look at what an affordable project would cost the city, that's a big number too. So no
Totally.
matter how you slice this, there are big numbers. And we can't get to, you know, the next RENA allocation with 20% affordable, using the private sector, private property. So, you know, it's just, this is a situation that is difficult to you know, win.
yeah. Well, and being a workshop, I wanted to make sure we're all
Yep,
thinking
yep,
about
yep,
the
yep,
bigger
that's good.
picture and how everything fits together.
And ultimately, you know, bringing back the numbers, I want to make an informed decision. I'm just, you know, trying to be creative
Yep,
with the
and-
way
and-
we solve this problem.
I think I'm doing the same thing. So let me continue on. So I learned last time that laws change in the middle of the process and in a bad way. And so, Barbara, are there any new laws on the horizon that could detrimentally affect what we're thinking of doing or potentially planning to do? Is there anything I should be worrying about now so that when we get closer to 2024, we don't go, oh man, I wish we'd done it differently?
Not yet. I think one issue is that not many cities, you're the first city I've worked with that's come close to, come close to running out of sites, if you want to put it that way. And so as, you know, that's when it affects more people is when the legislature tends to think about it. There have not been a lot of changes in housing element law since your housing element was approved in 2021. There's one important bill about emergency shelters, but aside from that, I would say that HCD has gotten much tougher. It's harder to get a housing element approved now. And I don't mean it was easy for the city, but I in working with cities, it's become very hard to get an approved housing element. But that doesn't reflect a change in state law. In terms of the laws I'm aware of, more have to do with approvals. For instance, Senator Wiener has a bill to allow what are called SB 35 projects in the coastal zone. There are other projects to exempt dormitories, office conversions, and other similar uses from, from most local control, anyway.
Okay, thank you. Last comment I wanted to make is that when we were talking at the Planning Commission about the higher inclusionary rate, and I know there was some discussion about allowing limiting the financial of the inclusionary rate that goes on every lot in the city today, and that the financial limitation is in the 20% range, right? 15, 20. We're at 20 for low income right now. But what the Planning Commission unanimously recommended to the council was the ability to go up to 50%. Now, when we did that, I kind of assumed the answer was somewhere in between. I really didn't think that we would go straight back to a free upgrade, because what happened was the R30 properties, the 15 R30 properties, went from their base zone, whatever that might be, in some cases rural residential, some cases residential, some cases commercial. They went to R30, and there was a lucrative increase in the value of the property. There was a huge increase, even larger, in the developer profit made. And that's all in the KMA study that the city commissioned. And when we questioned KMA, when I questioned KMA at the Planning Commission, they said they only looked at the land value increase. That in this case, they did not look at the developer increase. And we asked, do you do that in some cases? And they said for other cities, sometimes we do that. And so that's why I think the KMA study differed so radically from what Kevin Doyle did. And not only Kevin Doyle, Dan Vaughn did a back of the envelope. I think Kevin's was the most detailed. And so that's why I think for some classes, so although the recommendation from the Planning Commission for 50% was unanimous and came across that way, I had proposed a compromise in between where we took 3 different classes of properties, and you could see this in the KMA study. Rural residential to R30 was a huge value increase and if you look at the numbers, they could support, even KMA agreed, could go above 20, 25, could at least go to 25, maybe even to 30. Residential, and when I say residential, I mean R11 to R20, 25, whatever our higher one is. And then you have commercial, and commercial probably was the one that could support the least amount of additional inclusionary. And what my recommendation that I did not get out of the Planning Commission, but I'm pitching here tonight as a thought, is that we do increased inclusionary on, depending on whether you're going from a rural residential, RR, to RR, what is it, 5? 7? 7, right? And then that has a percentage, and then for the more dense multifamily, you have a much smaller number, and for commercial, we have a nominal number. And so it would be a way to tailor the inclusionary value that we get out of the property, that the citizens get to share in the step up in the value to the actual step up value that occurs. So.
Yes, so at that time, we were considering the inclusionary ordinance. We were under court order to adopt a housing element. We were being threatened by HCD. There were a number of issues that made taking a step that the Planning Commission recommended quite risky.
And what I went one further that didn't make it to you, so I'm suggesting it now as a possibility for this workshop of something to.
And actually, what I was going to say is that we won't make the same mistake twice. And I'm more inclined towards conditional zoning. So if there's a private property owner out there that's interested in an overlay or housing element update opportunity for a higher density, they need to show us what the percentage of affordable they will provide in that project. And I think that there are clearly parcels in our community that have significant increases in value by being zoned at R30. We saw 15 of them. It was terrible to have to do our housing element update under a court order.
So it sounds like we're in violent agreement.
We are in agreement in large part, and I just, this is, I think the way you get there is the question, and I don't think that, fudging with the inclusionary housing ordinance is the right way. I prefer a negotiation with the property owner. I am someone who experienced the dishonesty that was the Goodson project, where it was promised as a 198-unit senior apartment complex, and it wasn't submitted as a project in that configuration. And so my expectation is that if we are required to upzone private property, that it will be done with a pretty firm agreement about the project that may come from that. So, Deputy Mayor Lyons.
Yeah, I'd like to shine a little bit of a light on the idea of building our own internal funds. It's not so much that I expect that we will then become the only source of money to invest and to subsidize affordable housing. It's more, and I'd like to end up today by giving staff a direction, something like this, where we can look at what the tools are that exist that other communities might be able to access. I know there's some examples. I've been doing some research. I've got one in the community outside of Aspen where they've put together some funding mechanisms to be able to meet their community objectives of providing workforce housing and affordability of housing. I think there's some examples out there we might want to look at. I understand that's a different state. But I follow legislation to the extent that I can, and I do know so far there is new legislation being proposed that's focused on tax increment financing, which is kind of harkens back to our redevelopment district financing, which we now haven't had in place for over 10 years. Back when we had redevelopment districts, and through tools like tax increment financing, we're able to leverage other kind of commercial businesses, commercial tax revenue in order to invest in things like housing. I know there's experts out there who know it better than I do, but the fact that the state has proposed legislation that looks like it might end up being something like tax increment financing, which reminds me of redevelopment districts, I feel really enthusiastic about that, and think that if we do go in that direction, there may be some near future opportunities to use these tools, these mechanisms to help us with affordable housing. So I just wanted to shine a little bit of a light on that. And if anyone else has more information on that, I'd love to hear it.
Okay. I see no other requests to speak. Now, there was talk about a second part of this meeting, but we're at 5:25, and I think that the second part that you proposed is probably the more controversial part. So I think we should probably bring that back in a separate meeting unless there's desire by the council. Councilmember Hinsey.
I'd love to have that conversation today with a quick break in between. 2 minutes.
Well, so what was the format? What was the outline? Can you give me an outline of what you're planning to do?
Yes, it would be an overview of the tool, some of its functionality, and some of the site criteria and site methodology.
Yeah, tonight, our purpose today is just to provide you what the potential and the possibility of the tools that we have in place.
Specific sites, or?
We're not going to discuss any specific sites. We're just going to go over the tool and some of the criteria that we would suggest for the council to consider. And then we can always come back later and expand on that conversation and then potentially get direction from the city council on next direction.
Okay, and so why don't we begin that without a break, if that's okay? All right. Councilmember Blackwell, did you want to have a question first?
I was just, oops, sorry. I was going to ask if we could also get specific before we break here about the next steps and the timeline, because I think that's somewhat vague, and for my benefit as well, but I think it'd be very helpful to know, and we do have some time pressure, so
Yep.
I think it'd be helpful.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Robert Kane. I'm with Housel Levine. We're a sub-consultant to Kimley Horn, your consultant working on the housing element update. I'm going to briefly go through the methodology and the framework for the tool that we're going to use to identify sites and work through this process to get the best fit for the city to meet their RENA obligations. We're going to go through a site suitability and identification of potential sites. This is a very interactive process, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Once we get to those selected sites, there's an opportunity to extend an exercise for community engagement to get some feedback on the sites that have been identified. And then we can work through a scenario planning process where we look at each site and we look at the different densities that could be programmed there to meet the RENA obligations. And with that being said, we will need to do a site feasibility analysis and justification. One of the criteria that has newly been introduced into the housing element update process is very thorough site feasibility and justification analysis, which will ultimately lead to a final identification of sites. We will take a couple different processes to identify these sites. We'll identify candidate sites based on various variables, right? So in a second here, I'll kind of go through that, what the site feasibility criteria would be. That is definitely driven by the goals and desires of the community. So we'll be working through that to identify those criterias. We'll also eliminate sites based on constraints, physical constraints of the property or environmental constraints. We will take the site suitability analysis that I'll talk about here in a second, and we'll apply a weighted suitability model customized to the city's requirements and goals. And we'll use that to score each site, each opportunity site, so that we have some substantive analysis done and justification for why these sites are initially identified as good opportunity sites. Some of the site suitability factors, now it's not limited to these, but these are some of the site suitability factors we've used in other communities to do this data-driven process of site suitability and identification. And these are just a handful, and you'll see at the very last bullet point, city-specific factors. What are some of the important factors that we should consider in this community to identify these sites? This slide illustrates some of the sample factors. A lot of these factors that you see here in this slide are location-based, right? Proximity to amenities, quality of life issues, proximity to transit, to jobs, to grocery stores, and high-quality transit corridors. So these are all criterias that are based on guidance from HCD for housing sites, especially in the affordable range of housing units, and that is what we're focusing this additional site suitability analysis on. This is just a screenshot of the tool. So I've I mentioned a couple of times the site suitability modeler, right? So we can take different layers, and so that site RENA characteristics on the right-hand side are the different factors that we can put into the site suitability model. And then we can define those suitability scores. As you see here on the left-hand side, we can define the suitability factors based on age of building, right? So there's some guidance from ACD as it relates to the age of a building and its likelihood of being redeveloped. So we're looking at in this particular case, this would be on opportunity sites that are non-vacant, right? Existing developments that look to have an opportunity for redevelopment. And then with that being said, this tool, which is ArcGIS Urban, is it's a web-based tool that provides some 3D visualizations of a potential site. So what we have here, we're just showing on the right-hand side, existing development, and then how you could program, on the right-hand side, how you could program that site to accommodate additional units, and then give you a visualization of the proposed development to see how that fits into the existing urban fabric or the community fabric and built environment. With that being said, once we identify these sites and the council and staff have identified what we're going to call at this point the preferred alternative, the preferred sites, or one of the preferred alternatives, you have the opportunity to share that with the community through a web mapping application. In this particular case, on the right-hand side, there's a screenshot of a community where we used Map Social, and it's an interactive web map, so you can zoom in and look at the criteria in the scoring of a property and provide feedback whether or not you think that's a good site. And with this application, you also have the opportunity to maybe identify a site that a community stakeholder or a community member might find or think is a good site that we should look at further. And once that's done, so sort of the next steps in this phase is to work with the city council to identify those site selection priorities and those suitability factors we're going to use. Run that initial site suitability analysis to identify these candidate sites, and then just do a calculation of development capacity, right? So as we identify these sites, we'll also classify what affordability range that those would qualify, and that's based on HCD guidance. It will come back to the city council to review those sites. If those sites look to be, meet the goals of the council, we will share those sites, like I said before, in that mapping application to gain additional feedback, take in that feedback, and reconvene and refine those sites based on that feedback. So that's the next steps that we're planning to do. And so the idea here is to be a very holistic process that's data-driven and has a lot of community engagement involved, so that we get the best fit for moving forward. I'm available to answer any questions.
Okay, Councilmember Hensy.
Thank you. That it will never be easier than today to breeze through this process, as in the way that you just did it. And what I'm understanding and hearing from this meeting is that we will have a long and probably controversial process ahead of us to be able to find the density that we need to be able to upzone and then put it forward to our voters and hope to get a yes vote on that. And so in that spirit, I would like to draw my colleagues' attention and read something that stood out to me as part of this staff report. And it's in Barbara's well-written memo. It's near the end in the paragraph just before the conclusion. And Barbara writes, "The city may also identify adequate sites through other means, such as by identifying approved and proposed affordable units on sites not listed in the housing element." And so in the interest of staying compliant, keeping our housing element intact, what I think we should do at this time is to direct our city staff to bring back a project to us that can be 100% affordable, and not have to upzone it, not have to go through this long process to do so. That site to me very clearly is L7. And I think that we could propose something modest there that would be in the range of 30 to 45 units. I think we had some speakers here tonight who articulated it very well, that no net loss is a numbers game, and sometimes we get lost in the numbers. But on the other side of all this are people's lives. So through pursuit of a project such as this, we could have 30 to 45 households find housing here in the city of Encinitas. So when we look at this number 55 that we're keeping in mind to stay compliant and to make sure that we are doing our due diligence as a city to provide for a range of income levels here in our city, I think it's pretty clear that this is the right site. I think that it is the right time for us to do this because what we've heard from previous cycles of attempting to upzone is that the neighbors there don't want to upzone L7. They want to keep it at the base zoning that it is right now, and I think that we can make good on that. I think that as the city in the seat of entitling and moving the 100% affordable project forward, we're really well positioned to do what neighbors would like, which is construct a park as part of this project, to construct sidewalks, connections, better trail connections, and perhaps even more than I can even articulate right now. So I'm happy to turn that into a formal motion, which I'll do because I think we should leave today with some tangible steps to making good on moving forward to our 100% goal for a housing project in our city. Thank you.
Well, I won't be supporting that because I don't think that's the best use of that site. And I think that the commitment to that Quail Gardens Drive is still undetermined what's going to happen when the roughly 800 units that have been proposed on Quail Gardens Drive are fully developed. In 2014, though, I did work with a developer to put together a senior apartment complex that was 60 units. And I think that what we really should be doing is working to put a measure on the ballot in 2024 that considered an upzone to a project like this, project-specific upzone for that site. And it's a senior apartment complex, which reduces the amount of traffic that you would generate from that site. There are a couple of benefits, but I think the reality is that this is something that we should have as a separate agenda item, because we want to be sure to give some clear direction and get some specificity to this. I don't necessarily want to send staff out to just, wonder what exactly we're trying to do. The other idea that I think might be worth exploring is the possibility of of an RFP, ask for proposals from developers. But again, I think that that's not something that I'm inclined to give direction to tonight. So I think that the site selection process here, we should give that a run. There's no question the city council for years now has been talking about a 100% affordable project, and that L7 site is clearly the easiest to develop in a short period of time, and so I recognize that there's going to be some interest in that. So with that, Deputy Mayor Lyons?
I was just wondering, I think that the discussion of 100% affordable really falls under the umbrella of this meeting here today. We've talked about it as one of the ways to move forward with meeting our RENA obligations. And so based on that, but also based on some suggestions and thoughts Mayor Kranz has had, we have been giving 100% affordable a lot of thought over a long period of time. I think I'm generally inclined to say, let's make a decision, let's move something forward. And one of the reasons I like what Councilmember Hinsey has said is that without going through rezoning on L7, I mean, I don't want to do a rezoning on L7. I say that because I know the public in the past has come forward and said, please, we don't want density there. We don't want more units on Quail Gardens Drive. We're aware of that. We know that history. So moving forward with something that lays gently on the land, that doesn't require a rezoning, doesn't kick in with Prop A, seems like the simplest and least objectionable way to move forward with 100% affordable. And I'm in favor of that. I will second your motion, Kelly, Councilmember Hinsey. I pressed my button because I was going to say something else. But since you've brought this forward, I do want to say that I support that we look at how to do, I think it was mentioned too, an RFP, so that, I mean, it's more complex than just say, let's advise staff to do some affordable housing on L7. There's lots of ways it can move forward, but I think the quickest, the most streamlined, the most effective would be to develop an RFP that has those parameters that Councilmember Hinsey identified, trail connections, a park, maybe a model for how we manage stormwater. This would be under our control as a city. We get to set those parameters. We would get to say, this is going to be a model for how to do it right, and we want to learn from what we've heard from the citizens over the years and be in control of what happens on this site, and then send it out for an RFP, and then connect with affordable housing developers who can help us connect to the resources that are external to our city to subsidize the affordable housing. So all the pieces are beginning to click into place in my mind. So that's why I'm seconding that. I'm going to set my other comment aside, but because it's not related, but I will maybe loop in later.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My comment was on the criteria that you were presenting, the site selection priorities, and I know we'll have a lot of conversation about that. Thanks for explaining it so well. Something I didn't see on your list that other communities may not have thought of, but is really in the forefront of my mind, and I want to introduce this to my colleagues and to the public to see if it resonates with you, is have a criteria to preserve existing affordable housing. We have existing affordable housing in our community. When I think of that, I think of mobile home parks, but there's other existing affordable housing. And the way our policies are written now, we can go in there and take those out and not even replace it. And yeah, if we have affordable housing, we could take out 100% affordable housing, mobile home park, come in with a market rate and 20% affordable housing, and count that as RENA. We can't count the existing affordable housing. So whether this is how I mean, it goes beyond what we have to do for RENA. It's like, what's the reality of our community? We have existing affordable housing. We need to preserve it. And so I would like to, for it to be considered by my colleagues and in this process to have a layer of preserving existing affordable housing. And maybe if you have some thoughts on that.
So, thank you, Deputy Mayor Lyons. So that's something that we can consider if we want to be explicit about it in our, whether it's no net loss or our housing element. I do want to share with the council that there is currently a state law in place that requires a replacement of any housing unit. So whether it's affordable or not, you have to replace existing inventory. And if it is affordable, if it's been rented or occupied by a low-income household within the past 5 years, then those units must be preserved, and the applicant or developers would be required to replace the affordable unit and make it deed restricted.
Maybe you could follow up with me on that, because that's not the interpretation I was given when I asked that question recently.
Okay,
And that's okay to clarify it for me.
will do.
Councilmember Ehlers.
So I felt like we drew a line earlier that said we weren't going to do site selection tonight, and I think the motion is premature by at least one meeting, and so I won't be supporting it tonight. I'm a comparative shopper. I believe I want to see what my options are. I actually like the idea of not upzoning L7 and developing it as it would have been developed anyways, and having more control. That sounds great. I'm just not ready to, and I'm going to use the phrase "light that fuse" tonight, because that's what it will do. And so, but you know, don't take that as I'm 100% against it. I just think the time is not yet appropriate for selecting sites. We've got roughly 15 minutes more left, and I don't think there's enough time to really debate the wheres. I thought tonight was more a workshop to select to learn about the landscape, the laws, and what we have to do. So I think that was my comment. So, but I'm intrigued by the idea, but not ready to support it tonight.
Councilmember Blackwell.
You know, in a similar vein, I actually am very supportive of looking at what we do with L7. I think it is part of our solution. A couple things I would like to see the options, though, laid out, not just the one that's about not rezoning. So I'd like to see them all, whether it's a senior complex of 60 units, which would require rezoning, or if it's just using the property as is. But it'd be good to see them all. So I agree with Bruce that this might be premature, this motion tonight, but I think we've got to make fast action on it. The other thing is L7's not going to solve the whole problem we have. And so I think that's why I go back to saying I would like to really understand, and maybe the city staff can come back to us. There is the bubble chart in the staff report, thank you very much, of the timeline, but it's pretty high level for the first few steps. There's a lot of very dense action that needs to happen over the next 6 months. So I would like to understand that details so we can get to some of these decisions.
Councilmember Hensy.
So I'll explain a little why I think this is the right moment, and that is because L7 is not site selection as it pertains to our housing element. And so this process that we're about to embark on is one of upzoning, to my understanding of what we'd be doing. And I think what we need to do is to avoid the situation where we are being threatened with losing our housing element because we've not made progress on the minimum of 55 units that we need to find somewhere before the vote takes place. And so by moving this forward expediently, we're putting ourselves in a safer position than losing control in the coming months. So I think it's important that we move forward with that. I can consider amending the motion so that something that comes back to us would be a consideration of L7 with its base zoning, and then some analysis of L7 as Mayor Krantz has described and what that would take. And if there's any other considerations for that site, I am happy to amend the motion as such.
Would Do you seconder?
I will second that modification.
And would you restate your motion? Would you mind?
So let's say that the motion is to direct staff to come back with a proposal for L7, which is a modest housing development at 100% affordability that would include an analysis of 30 to 45 sites. It could also include Mayor Kranz's proposal, an analysis of what it would take to do an upzone with 60, is it 60 senior?
Well, yeah, that's what it was originally, but I think we should look at, what's reasonable, but just say yes, a site that includes upzoning.
Okay.
Is that clear? And I would point out that, the fallacy that we perpetuate here sometimes when we're talking about 100% affordable is that it isn't just the land contribution that creates a 100% affordable project. And when I worked and got the pro forma for a project where the city would contribute the land for a 60-unit, 48 one-bedroom, 12 two-bedroom senior apartment complex, there was about a $7 million gap. So the city had to come up with $7 million in order to build this. And so as having just gone through the budget workshop, we see that we were working with about 1.45 million for our CIP project. So it isn't simply just let's have a project that we can do 100% affordable on this site. We have to figure out how to pay for it too. And so unless you have some secret stash of dough, we're going to have to probably go to the voters and ask for the resources in order to build a 100% affordable project. But I think one of the things that are this housing element approval and the process that we've seen from the private sector developing these sites is that the electorate is probably going to be very receptive to the notion that the city's got proposals to develop sites that have 100% affordability. And because the market approach, the private development approach is not working very well for this city, in my opinion. So I think there's a good chance to put together a project that would be supported. But you never know in this city. The notion of upzoning is one that is definitely a challenge to convince people that we should do that. And so we will have to wait and see. I would also point out that the process of the envisioned under Prop A was not what we did with our Measure T and Measure U, where we put overlays on parcels. It was intended to be that a project would go through the planning process and be approved, and then it would go to a vote. And so one of the things, if we were to decide that we could come up with a project that would be lower impact than developing at the current zoning as senior complex, then the process of getting that approved on a vote would be, I think, easier. And not only that, but we would net more affordable units out of a project like that. So instead of settling for 30 units just so that you don't have to go to a vote, I think there's some merit to the idea of being direct with the voters and saying, yeah, well, here's a project. It's lower impact because it's a senior apartment project, and put in the project the benefits that you get connecting the trails and doing the sidewalks, maybe some traffic mitigation, some traffic calming for that corridor that we weren't able to exact from the developers of the projects on that street. And I think that there's a healthy chance that we could succeed in a vote on that. Councilmember Ehlers.
I wanted to respond to a couple of comments that I've heard. The first one is that this is not site selection, and when in fact what we're talking about is putting it on the housing element, and that is site selection, even though it's not upzoning. I agree with that. Not all, in this case, it'd be the only one, not all units that then move on to the housing element as part of the site selection are upzoned. So I think it still is site selection. And I'll reiterate the comment I heard earlier that it's really a partial and probably, a quarter or a fifth of the total we need, so, or roughly, and I don't even know the answer. And that's part of what I want to learn first before I go decide. I also want to know the subsidy analysis and to understand the financials. Probably most importantly, and I think Mayor Krantz was getting to this, is that the way the last cycle went, the last housing element update went, it was whoever approached the city became part of the program, and we got some projects in places that were possibly the worst selection you could have possibly imagined. I'll pick on Goodson right off the bat. And I would much prefer, especially where we're talking about far fewer sites, probably not the 15, I would rather that we select those sites. That's the idea behind planning, is that the city is in control of the zoning, not the developers. And so I want to be in control and say, this is a good place, and I can mitigate the issues, and ideally have some sort of CEQA control over that, some sort of EIR or whatnot. And that's one of the rule changes that occurred here, is where we got this 20% by right that circumvents the CEQA EIRs. And so to Mayor Kranz's concept of, well, we pick and we also enter into a contract that would guarantee we get the mitigations with the project. So that's why I'm not ready to jump on the L7 bandwagon, even though I'm intrigued by it. Let me put it that way. So.
Speak again?
Yeah, I'll just say my final comment. Well, I think it's important that we bring it back to this group body, and I think that's exactly what I'm proposing tonight, for staff to do any analysis on all the complicated trade-offs that were mentioned by everybody here. We have to be able to say, staff, go do that analysis, even if it's at its most basic. And so I think a project like this, with such high interest from our community on a parcel that's owned by all of us as Encinitas residents, it will need additional analysis. And so by starting this process early, what I'm asking for from my colleagues tonight is that we move forward to say, this is something we want to analyze, this is something that we're open to, and I know that there'll be many stages between now and the moment we cut a ribbon for a 100% affordable project that you can say, this isn't the direction I'd like to go, let's consider this, we have a financing mechanism, let's go ahead and use that. And so what I'm asking for tonight is the support to direct our staff to start analyzing those options.
Right, and we've had the Cosmont study that looked at the site already, so we know we've got initial studies that have already been undertaken. So we're in a good place. I think that the biggest question that we would have is, whether there is, a project that would net us more affordable than pushing forward with existing zoning. And so, to me, that's worth taking the time to analyze and consider as a council. So that's the way the motion ended up, so I will be supporting it. And I think with that, we're ready to vote.
Motion carries with Councilmember Ehlers voting no.
Okay. With that, this special meeting is adjourned.
We can listen to the tape, and I would put it down.